There is a moment in the history of naval warfare that defies easy categorization. It is not a battle, exactly. There are no opposing fleets. There is no tactical genius on one side outmaneuvering a rigid adversary on the other. It is something quieter and far more terrible than that. It is the story of a ship that completed the most important delivery in the history of modern warfare, and was then forgotten. Forgotten by the Navy it served, forgotten by the command structure that sent it, forgotten long enough for the sea and everything living in it to consume nearly 600 men. The USS Indianapolis carried the weapon that would end the Second World War, and then the United States Navy lost track of it. What followed? In the black water of the Central Pacific, in the 4 days between the sinking and the rescue, in the courtroom that came afterward, and in the decades of silence that followed, is one of the most harrowing, institutionally damning, and humanly devastating episodes in American military history. It is a story about bureaucratic failure at the highest levels. It is a story about survival under conditions that the human body and mind are not designed to endure. It is a story about sharks, but not in the way the mythology has sometimes told it. And it is a story about a captain named Charles Butler, McVeigh III, who carried the weight of those 4 days for the rest of his life. To understand what happened to the Indianapolis, you have to understand the summer of 1945. You have to understand how close the war was to something, and how uncertain that something still felt to the men fighting it. By July of that year, the Pacific War had been running for 3.5 years. The Japanese home islands had been under sustained aerial bombardment since March, when General Curtis LeMay's B-29 superfortresses began the firebombing campaign that would ultimately kill more civilians than the atomic bombs that followed. Island after island had been taken at catastrophic cost. Iwo Jima, taken in February and March of 1945, produced nearly 7,000 American dead and 26,000 wounded. Okinawa, the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, was still winding down in June. American planners were already drafting Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, and their casualty estimates were staggering. Some projections ran into the hundreds of thousands of American dead. Some ran higher. In this context, a small group of scientists and military officers at Los Alamos, New Mexico, had been working for years on something that could theoretically end the war without an invasion. The Manhattan Project had produced, in July 1945, a working atomic weapon. On July 16th, at a site in the New Mexico desert called Trinity, the first nuclear device in history was detonated. The test was successful beyond what many of the scientists had dared hope. The yield was equivalent to approximately 21 kilotons of TNT. The decision was made to use the weapon against Japan. 2 targets had been selected, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs needed to be transported from Los Alamos to the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands, from which the B-29s of the 509th Composite Group would fly the missions. The transportation of the weapons components was the most sensitive military logistics operation of the war and possibly of any war. The question of which ship would carry them was answered at the highest levels of the United States Navy. The USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser commissioned in 1932. She displaced 9,800 tons at standard load, stretched 6 to 10 feet from bow to stern, and was powered by 4 Westinghouse geared turbines driving 4 shafts, giving her a maximum speed of 32.7 knots. Her main armament consisted of 9 8-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, forward, amidships, and aft, capable of firing a 335-pound projectile a distance of nearly 17 miles. She carried a complement of roughly 2,200 officers and enlisted men. She was also, by the summer of 1945, Admiral Raymond Spruance's flagship, the ship from which Spruance had commanded the Fifth Fleet through some of the most consequential naval battles of the Pacific War, including the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American carrier aviation had devastated 3 Japanese carrier air groups in what American aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The B. Indianapolis was a ship with history. She was a ship with a record. She was, by any measure, a significant vessel. Her captain was Charles Butler McVeigh III, a 50-year-old Naval Academy graduate from a distinguished naval family. His father, Charles Butler McVeigh Jr., had himself been a four-star admiral. McVeigh was regarded as a capable professional officer. He had commanded the Indianapolis since November 1944 and had taken her through the final campaigns of the Pacific War, including the operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In March 1945, the ship had been struck by a kamikaze off Okinawa, killing 9 men and requiring extensive repairs. She had returned to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, completed those repairs, and was now ready to resume operations. On July 16, 1945, the same day as the Trinity test, though McVeigh did not know this, the Indianapolis was ordered to report to the Mare Island Commandant for a special mission. What followed was extraordinary in its secrecy and its speed. A large crate and a smaller metal cylinder were loaded onto the ship under the strictest security conditions. McVeigh was told that the cargo was of the highest national importance. He was not told what it was. Almost no one on board was told. The crate, measuring roughly 5 feet by 5 feet by 15 feet, was bolted to the deck of the hangar space. The metal cylinder, containing the enriched uranium core of the bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima, was welded to the deck of the flag lieutenant's cabin. Marines were posted as guards around the clock. On July 16th, the Indianapolis WWII departed Mare Island and set course for Pearl Harbor at flank speed. She made the crossing in 74.5 hours, a new record for the passage. At Pearl Harbor, she refueled and took on supplies without delay, then departed almost immediately for Tinian, sailing without escort. The urgency was absolute. She arrived at Tinian on July 26th. The cargo, Little Boy's uranium components, was transferred to the island. The Indianapolis had completed her mission. The bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th had arrived at its staging point. History had been delivered. What happened next was the beginning of the catastrophe. The Indianapolis was ordered to proceed to Guam and from there to the Philippines, specifically to Leyte Gulf, where she was to report to the commander. Philippine Sea Frontier and join a training group preparing for the invasion of Japan. She departed Guam on July 28, 1945, at approximately 0900 hours, sailing alone and without escort on a heading that would take her northeast through the Philippine Sea toward Leyte. The routing was standard for a vessel of her class making a non-combat transit. She was given a routing order, SINCPAC routing instructions, serial 10CL45, that specified her course and expected time of arrival. The Indianapolis was expected to arrive at Leyte Gulf on the morning of July 31st. She was sailing at 17 knots, a standard transit speed, through waters that were considered relatively secure by July 1945. Japanese surface forces were essentially neutralized. Japanese air power was severely degraded, but Japanese submarines were still operating in the Central Pacific, and the waters through which the Indianapolis was sailing were not free of them. On the night of July 29th to 30th, 1945, the Japanese submarine I-58 Oz, commanded by Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, was running on the surface in the Central Pacific in an area roughly midway between Guam and Leyte. Hashimoto had been at sea since July 18th, operating as part of a patrol line established to intercept American shipping. He had not yet made contact with any target. His orders were to sink American vessels. He was armed with both standard Type 95 torpedoes and the newer Caton, human-guided torpedoes, essentially suicide weapons manned by volunteer pilots. Approximately 23:05 on the night of July 29th, a lookout on the I-58 spotted a dark shape on the horizon. Hashimoto ordered his crew to battle stations and began tracking the contact. What he saw as his submarine closed the distance was a large American warship, a cruiser, steaming without zigzagging on a steady course. The Indianapolis was not zigzagging that night. McVeigh had discretionary authority to zigzag or not depending on conditions. Visibility was poor, sea state was moderate, and the captain had judged that the tactical situation did not require the fuel consumption and added watch-standing burden of constant course changes. It was a judgment call. It was the kind of judgment call that hundreds of ship captains made every night of the war. Hashimoto chose not to use the chitin. He had 6 conventional Type 95 torpedoes ready in his forward tubes. He ordered a spread of 6 torpedoes fired at a range of approximately 1,500 yards. At 0014 on July 30th, 1945, the USS Indianapolis was struck. The first torpedo hits the ship on the starboard bow. The explosion is catastrophic. It blows off the bow entirely, and the forward compartments flood with terrifying speed. The second torpedo strikes amidships, directly beneath the bridge. It detonates the aviation fuel stored near the center of the ship, and the fireball that erupts is visible for miles. The ship shudders from bow to stern with the force of 2 concussions arriving within seconds of each other. The lights go out. The power fails. The communication systems, radio, interphone, everything, are severed or destroyed. The Indianapolis begins to list immediately to starboard. The list deepens within seconds. Men who had been sleeping in their bunks are thrown to the deck, to the bulkheads, into passageways suddenly filled with darkness and water and the smell of burning fuel. Men on deck are thrown from their feet by the force of the second explosion. The fire amidships climbs immediately, orange and white against the black Pacific sky. McVeigh on the bridge knows within seconds that the ship is mortally wounded. The bow is gone. The power is gone. The list is accelerating. He gives the EI order to prepare to abandon ship, but the communication system that would carry that order throughout the vessel is no longer functioning. Individual officers and petty officers relay the order by voice, by messenger, by whatever means are available. In the chaos of a ship dying in the dark, the order reaches some men and does not reach others. 3 distress signals are sent. The radio operators, working in conditions of partial power and structural collapse, transmit the ship's position and the nature of the emergency on multiple frequencies. The signals go out at approximately 15, 0020, and 0025, 3 separate transmissions, each containing the essential information. The Indianapolis has been torpedoed, she is sinking, her position is approximately 12 degrees north latitude, 134 degrees 48 minutes east longitude. No one answers. The Indianapolis rolls onto her starboard side and sinks, bow first, at approximately 0:29 on July 30th, 1945. From the moment of the first torpedo impact to the moment she disappears beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, 12 minutes have elapsed. Of the 1,195 men aboard, approximately 900 make it into the water. The rest, those below decks in compartments sealed by flooding, those trapped by structural collapse, those killed by the initial explosions and the fire, go down with the ship. The 900 men who enter the water do so in varying states. Some are in life jackets, some are not. Some have found life rafts. Some have nothing but the Kapok life preservers that were standard issue aboard American warships of that era. Preservers that would keep a man afloat but would not keep him warm, and would not keep him safe, and would not, in the days that followed, keep him alive in the way he needed to be kept alive. The men are in the Philippine Sea. The water temperature at the surface is approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough, in theory, to sustain life for an extended period without hypothermia, becoming the primary threat. But the Philippine Sea in July is also home to oceanic white-tip sharks, one of the most aggressive large shark species in the world. And the explosions that have just destroyed the Indianapolis, the fire, the fuel oil spreading across the surface, the biological material entering the water from the men who did not survive, have announced the presence of something in the water. The sharks come during the first night. What follows over the next 4 days is almost beyond description, and has, in some tellings, been distorted by mythology and dramatization to the point where the reality has been partially obscured. The reality is terrible enough. The survivors are scattered over an area of approximately 4 to 5 miles of open ocean. They are grouped in clusters, some larger, some smaller, based on how they entered the water and how the currents and their own swimming have distributed them in the hours after the sinking. The largest group, estimated at 300 to 400 men, is centered around a cluster of life rafts and floater nets that were launched before the ship went down. Smaller groups are scattered at varying distances. The problems they face are multiple and compounding. Thirst is immediate. Fresh water is limited, often contaminated, often lost in the chaos of the sinking. The sun in the tropics in late July is savage. Many men drink salt water. This is fatal. It accelerates dehydration and causes progressive deterioration of mental function, delirium, coma. The impulse, after 2 days without fresh water under a tropical sun, is overwhelming. The men who resist it tend to survive longer. Many cannot resist. The sharks come during the first night and continue throughout the 4 days. The oceanic whitetip is an open ocean predator that has evolved to exploit exactly this kind of situation. Injured animals at the surface, biological, material in the water, the confusion of a group under sustained stress. The dead draw initial attention. The sharks do not limit themselves to the dead. They take men from the periphery of the groups, at night when the clusters are loosest, during the day when a man drifts or loses consciousness. The men who watch and cannot help carry what they witness for the rest of their lives. Some will never enter the ocean again. And while this is happening, while 900 men are dying in the Philippine Sea, the United States Navy does not know the Indianapolis is missing. This requires explanation. It requires explanation because it is, by any rational assessment, a catastrophic failure of the administrative and operational systems that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. The failure has multiple layers and understanding. Those layers is essential to understanding the full tragedy. The first layer is the distress signals. 3 signals were sent from the Indianapolis in the minutes before she sank. Those signals were received. At least one of them was definitively received at a naval radio station. The officer on duty at that station, exhausted after a long watch, did not act on it. He later stated that he thought it might be a Japanese deception, that the enemy sometimes transmitted false distress signals on American frequencies to draw rescue vessels into ambush. He did not pass the signal up the chain of command. He did not wake his superior. He logged the receipt of the signal and did nothing further. There is evidence that at least 2 other stations also received signals from the Indianapolis that night. Neither took action. The second layer is the arrival reporting system, or rather, its absence. When the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on the morning of July 31st, no alarm was raised. This is because the system for tracking ship arrivals at Leyte Gulf during this period of the war was essentially dysfunctional. Ships arrived and departed in such volume, and the administrative burden was so significant that a ship failing to arrive was not automatically flagged as an emergency. The port director's office at Leyte Gulf operated under a policy, later described by investigators as a non-arrival policy, that held that a ship's non-arrival was the responsibility of the originating command, not the receiving command. No one at Leyte Gulf checked to see why the Indianapolis had not appeared. No one contacted Guam to ask. No one initiated a search. The third layer is the routing system itself. The Indianapolis had been sent on a transit route through waters that were not under active anti-submarine patrol. She had been given no escort, a decision that was standard for the period and cannot, in isolation, be called negligent given the assessments of the submarine threat in that area. But the combination of no escort, no active tracking of her transit, a non-arrival reporting system that did not function, and distress signals that were received and ignored created a gap, a silence, in which 900 men were dying. And no one in the United States Navy was looking for them. The first indication that something had gone wrong came not from any of the administrative systems that should have detected the problem. It came from an accident. On the afternoon of August 2nd, approximately 84 hours after the Indianapolis sank, a Lockheed PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol over the Philippine Sea. Gwynn's aircraft was not searching for survivors. He was not responding to any alert. He was conducting a scheduled patrol of an area that happened by chance to include the approximate position where the Indianapolis had gone down. Gwynn noticed something unusual in the water. He descended for a closer look. What he saw, what he described in his subsequent report with the careful, precise language of a naval aviator trying to make sense of something he had no framework for, was a long slick of oil on the surface, and within and around that slick, figures in the water, a great many figures. Gwynn immediately broke radio silence and transmitted a report to his base at Peleliu. He then began circling the survivors, dropping life rafts and emergency supplies from his aircraft. He also transmitted the position of the survivors continuously so that rescue vessels could be vectored to the location. It was Gwyn's transmission that finally initiated the rescue operation. 4 days, approximately 15 hours, and an unknowable number of deaths after the Indianapolis sank. The response, once initiated, was significant. A Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant R. Adrian Marks landed on the open ocean, a dangerous maneuver in any sea state, to begin pulling survivors directly from the water. Marks, witnessing the shark attacks from the air before he landed, made the decision to put his aircraft down without waiting for authorization from his command. He later said he saw a man taken by a shark as he was preparing to land, and that settled the matter. His Catalina was not designed to take on more than a handful of survivors. It was a patrol aircraft, not a rescue boat. But Marks and his crew pulled men from the water and lashed them to the wings of the plane until the aircraft was dangerously overloaded. He refused to take off until surface vessels arrived. The destroyer, USS Cecil J. Doyle, under Commander W. Graham Claytor, Jr., was the first surface vessel to reach the survivors, arriving in the early hours of August 3rd. The Doyle turned its powerful searchlight skyward, not to illuminate the water, but to serve as a beacon for the other rescue vessels that were converging on the position. It was an act of seamanship that the survivors in the water have never forgotten. In the darkness, after 4 days and 4 nights in the Philippine Sea, the light of the Doyle's searchlight pointing straight up into the sky was the first indication most of them had that the world had finally remembered they were there. The rescue operation took approximately 40 hours. When it was complete, 316 men had been pulled from the Philippine Sea alive. Of those, many were severely injured, dehydrated, and psychologically shattered in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves. Of the 1,195 men who had been aboard when the Indianapolis left Guam, 879 were dead. Approximately 300 died in the sinking itself. Approximately 579 died in the 4 days that followed. The precise breakdown between shark attack, drowning, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and the psychological collapse that sometimes comes. When a man has endured the unendurable, that breakdown cannot be definitively established. The survivors' accounts give the picture its human texture. The numbers give it its weight: 879 men. The Navy's response to the disaster, once it became public, followed a pattern that is familiar in institutional history. The effort to find an explanation that locates the failure as narrowly as possible in the decision of a single identifiable individual rather than in the systemic failures that actually produce the outcome. The Navy investigated. Courts of inquiry were convened, and in the end, the Navy charged Captain Charles McVeigh III with hazarding his vessel by failing to order zigzag evasive maneuvers. The charge is worth examining carefully because it has been examined by historians, by naval officers, by lawyers, and by the survivors themselves for decades, and the examination has not been kind to the Navy's decision. Naval doctrine during the Second World War held that ships under threat of submarine attack should zigzag, make frequent, irregular changes, of course, to complicate the firing solution for a submarine commander. McVeigh had discretionary authority to zigzag or not based on his assessment of conditions. He had judged that visibility was limited, sea state moderate, and the local submarine threat low enough that constant course changes were not warranted. It was a reasonable professional judgment. Commander Hashimoto was brought to Washington to testify at McVeigh's court-martial, an extraordinary and deeply controversial decision, bringing the enemy commander to testify against an American officer. In a proceeding many felt was about institutional self-protection rather than justice. Hashimoto testified under oath that whether the Indianapolis had been zigzagging or not would not have changed the outcome. He had firing solutions throughout his approach. The range was short. The torpedoes were accurate. He would have fired regardless. McVeigh was convicted. He was convicted of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag, the only commander in the United States Navy to be court-martialed for the loss of his ship in combat during the Second World War. The men who had failed to act on the distress signals were never charged. The officers whose administrative failures allowed the ship to go unnoticed for 4 days were never charged. The systemic failures in the routing and arrival reporting systems that made such an oversight possible were acknowledged, corrected, and quietly set aside. The court-martial of Charles McVeigh was the Navy's answer to the question of accountability, and it was an answer that many of the men who had survived those 4 days in the Philippine Sea refused to accept. McVeigh was sentenced and then, remarkably, remitted. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal remitted the sentence, meaning McVeigh retained his naval career and ultimately retired as a rear admiral. He retired in 1949. He lived quietly in Connecticut. He received, in the years after the war, letters from the families of men who had died on the Indianapolis. Letters that held him responsible, that told him he had killed their sons and husbands. Some were vicious, some were merely despairing. They came every year, particularly around the anniversary of the sinking. On November 6, 1968, Charles Butler McVeigh III walked out of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, and shot himself with his service revolver. He was carrying in his hand a toy sailor figurine, the kind of thing a child might play with. He was found on the front lawn. He was 70 years old. The survivors of the USS Indianapolis spent decades trying to clear his name. They testified before Congress. They lobbied the Navy. They gave interviews and wrote letters and organized reunions where they made clear, year after year, that they did not hold Charles McVeigh responsible for what had happened to them. In 1999, a 11-year-old sixth grader from Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott, who had become interested in the story after seeing the film Jaws, in which the character Quint describes the sinking of the Indianapolis, organized a letter-writing campaign and testified before the House Armed Services Committee. His testimony helped push forward legislation that was ultimately signed into law by President Bill Clinton in October 2000, 55 years after the sinking. The legislation directed the Secretary of the Navy to issue a statement that Charles McVeigh's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. It was a symbolic act. It could not restore the years, the reputation, or the life that the court-martial had cost. But it was something. The survivors, many of them in their 70s and 80s by then, considered it something. They had not stopped fighting for it. The wreck of the USS Indianapolis was located on August 19, 2017, by a research team led by Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder and maritime history enthusiast who funded expeditions to find historically significant shipwrecks. The ship lies in the Philippine Sea at a depth of approximately 5,500 meters, 3.5 miles beneath the surface. The search team used historical records, the survivor accounts, and advanced underwater survey technology to locate the wreck after it had remained lost for 72 years. The photographs they returned with showed the bow section and stern section separated, confirming the violence of the sinking, and portions of the hull still bearing the hull number 35 that had identified her as the Indianapolis. There is something in those images that resists easy articulation. The ship that carried the components of the weapon that ended the Second World War is now at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, in darkness, 3.5 miles down, where she will remain as long as the sea exists. The men who went down with her, and the men who died in the 4 days after, are there too, or whatever the sea has made of them over the intervening 80 years. 300 men who died in the sinking, 579 who survived it and then did not. The USS Indianapolis made her final voyage at 17 knots through a quiet sea, on a clear night in late July, having just completed an act that would alter the course of human history. She carried no escort. She sent 3 distress signals. No one answered. And the United States Navy did not notice she was gone for 4.5 days, 879 men. The number is specific because the specificity is the point. Not nearly 900, not almost 1,000, 879. Each of them a person who had been young, who had eaten breakfast that morning, who had written letters home, who had a name in a service record and a face in a photograph and a family somewhere in the continental United States, waiting for a ship that would never come home and news that no family should have to receive. The official casualty list runs to pages. The names are alphabetical. They begin with Abernathy and end with Zoll. They include boys of 17 who had enlisted by lying about their age, career petty officers with 15 years of service, ensigns fresh from training, a ship's cook, a chaplain, a pharmacist's mate who spent his last hours in the water trying to keep other men alive. They include a young sailor named Felton Outland, who was 20 years old and from North Carolina. They include a gunner's mate named Clarence Hirschberger, who was 19. They include the men whose names appear only by subtraction, present on the manifest, absent from the survivor list. The war ended 5 weeks after the Indianapolis sank. The bomb she had carried to Tinian was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, killing between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the weeks that followed. A second bomb fell on Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. The men who had carried the weapon that ended it had been dead for 5 weeks. There is a moral architecture to this history that does not resolve neatly, and the temptation to force resolution onto it should be resisted. The atomic bombs that the Indianapolis helped deliver ended the war, and the ending of the war saved lives. American lives, Japanese lives, the lives of the prisoners and civilians and soldiers who would have died in the invasion that did not happen. These are facts contested in their implications by historians for 80 years and likely to remain contested. The men who died on the Indianapolis died in service of a mission that was completed successfully. The weapon they carried was used. The war ended. These are also facts. None of this makes the death of 879 men any less real. None of it makes the 4 days in the Philippine Sea any less terrible. None of it makes the failures of the United States Navy, the ignored distress signals, the missing ship that no one missed, the court-martial of a captain as an institutional act of self-protection, any less damning. The Indianapolis occupies a specific and irreducible place in the history of the Second World War and in the history of the United States Navy. She is the ship that made Hiroshima possible. She is the ship that no one came to find. She is the worst naval disaster, in terms of loss of life at sea, in the history of the United States Navy. She is the ship whose captain was blamed for what happened and eventually destroyed by the blame. She is the ship whose survivors spent 55 years fighting for an exoneration that came too late to matter to many of them, and came too late, by 32 years, to matter to the man they were fighting for. And she is, in a very specific and literal sense, a ship that asked for help 3 times, in the dark, in the Central Pacific, and received no answer. That silence, the silence on the other end of 3 radio transmissions sent in the 12 minutes before the sea took her, is the silence at the center of this story. It is the silence that allowed everything that followed. It is the silence that, 879 times over, became permanent. In 1945, the United States Navy was the most powerful naval force in the history of the world. It operated thousands of vessels across every ocean on the planet. It had communication systems that reached from the Aleutian Islands to the Persian Gulf. It had administrative systems designed to track the movement of every significant vessel in its fleet. It had officers trained to respond to emergencies, to evaluate signals, to ask the question that should have been asked on the morning of July 31st. Where is the Indianapolis? The question was not asked. The Indianapolis had sailed out of Guam on July 28th, completed an act of enormous historical consequence, and disappeared into the Philippine Sea. She had sent 3 signals.
You're almost there.
She had not arrived where she was expected. She had gone quiet.
Come on, pull.
And the system, the vast, powerful, sophisticated system of the United States Navy in the summer of 1945, had not noticed. The survivors remember the silence. They have spoken about it in interviews and memoirs and testimonies over 8 decades. And the thing that comes through most consistently is not the sharks, though the sharks are real and the memory of them is real. It is the silence, the waiting, the sky above the Philippine Sea, cloudless and enormous, empty of aircraft. The horizon, visible for miles in every direction, empty of ships. The 4th morning arriving, the sun coming up again over waters. That had been a kind of slow execution for 4 days. And still nothing coming, still no one. And then the Ventura, Gwynn's aircraft appearing in the distance. dropping lower, circling, the recognition spreading through the survivors in the water that something was different this time, that someone had seen them, the men who survived, the 316 who were pulled from the Philippine Sea in those first desperate hours after Gwen's sighting, carried what they had seen and what they had endured out of the water with them, and they carried it for the rest of their lives. Many of them carried it silently. The culture of that generation was not a culture that made space for the kind of testimony that healing might have required. They built their families. They worked their jobs. They returned to the sea, some of them, and could not enter it, others. They held reunions. The survivors of the USS Indianapolis held their first formal reunion in 1960 and continued annually until the survivor population became too small to gather. At those reunions, they spoke to each other about things they did not speak about elsewhere. The last known survivor, Harold Bray Jr., died in February 2022 at the age of 96. With his passing, the living memory of those 4 days in the Philippine Sea moved entirely into the documents and the testimonies and the photographs, and into the wreck itself, sitting in darkness at 5,500 meters in a sea that keeps its own counsel. But the record remains. The court-martial transcripts, the survivor accounts, the photographs of 316 gaunt, sunburned men being lifted from the water. The hull number, 35, still visible in the images from the wreck, 3.5 miles down, where the Indianapolis has rested for 80 years, and 3 unanswered radio signals transmitted in the dark over the Philippine Sea on the night of July 29th to 30th, 1945. That is where this story ends and does not end. The USS Indianapolis carried the weapon that ended the most destructive war in human history. She completed her mission. She asked for help and received no answer. And the Navy that sent her, the most powerful naval force in the history of the world, did not notice she was gone for 4.5 days, while the sea did what seas do to men left alone in them. The casualty list begins with Abernathy and ends with Zoll. 879 names, each of them a person, each of them specific and irreplaceable, and owed the dignity of being remembered as exactly that. 879.